It was 1944, and the dust of East Texas clung to the air like the weight of the war itself. For Yuki Tanaka, a Japanese POW who had never known the world beyond the confines of war camps, the sight before her felt like stepping into another universe. The Texas sky stretched impossibly wide, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and horses, the sound of hammers pounding and saws slicing through wood. But what stood before her, what she couldn't comprehend, was the sight of men, dressed in worn denim and cowboy hats carrying axes and ropes, their muscles rippling with the raw power of the land they tamed. The very image of American lumberjacks, rugged, confident, wild, was as foreign to her as the very idea of freedom. Yuki's heart raced as the men shouted across the clearing, their voices echoing with the promise of untamed landscapes and untold stories. This was not the controlled world of war. This was something far more unpredictable. For the first time in her life, Yuki was struck by something she had never expected. Fear not from the enemy, but from an entirely unfamiliar world. She had spent the past months trapped in the endless routine of the POW camp. The cold barracks, the unforgiving American guards, the constant ache of hunger, the scraping of boots on stone, the rattle of a rifle when they were marched to work or fed scraps. In this new world, there were no cold walls, no iron bars. There was just the wide, unending horizon, and the sound of men and machines shaping the land to their will. Each lumberjack seemed to carry the essence of the land itself, wild, free, a force of nature in their own right. They didn't cower from the earth. They faced it head-on, cleaving it into usable blocks with raw strength, sweat, and will. For Yuki, who had spent her life in the shadows of soldiers and war machines, this new world was almost as terrifying as it was fascinating. Her gaze shifted to the horses. Powerful, muscular creatures that ran like the wind, their manes flying behind them as they leaped over small logs and streams. She had only heard of such beasts in stories, never imagining she would see them up close. The sight was both enchanting and intimidating. How could such creatures exist in the world she knew? How could a place so alive exist when she had only known a world of metal and concrete? The thudding of bombs and the rush of enemy jets. It wasn't just the men who were strange to her. It was the land itself, the very way it was shaped by these lumberjacks, men who worked not for conquest but for creation. She had never seen anything like it. The land had always been an enemy in her life. But here in this strange corner of the world, the land was a companion. Yuki's breath caught in her chest as she took in the scene before her. The men worked with such confidence, a rhythm that came not from force but from familiarity, a deep connection to the earth beneath their boots. Their eyes never left their task. Every swing of the axe was deliberate, precise. They were masters of this world, and Yuki, a foreigner in every sense, was left to watch in awe. She felt a strange pang in her chest, a longing for something she couldn't quite define. She had never felt this before. There had always been war, always been a sense of duty and survival, but there had never been the sense of awe, of beauty, that gripped her now. This land, this world, and it felt free, and she was as shackled by her past as the other POWs. She was one of them now, a prisoner of war, a cog in the machine. But watching the men working so effortlessly in the sun, a spark of something she hadn't felt in years flared in her chest. Something like hope. Could it be possible, she wondered, that this wasn't just another battlefield? That maybe here, amid the noise of saws and horses, was the possibility of something else? The distant sound of a horse's hooves broke her reverie, and she snapped her head to the side. The cowboy riding towards her caught her off guard. His gaze was hard, yet there was something gentle in his eyes, a quiet understanding that spoke of the land, of living with it instead of fighting against it. She had never seen anything like it. The men she had known had all been soldiers, hardened and fierce. But this cowboy? He was something else. As the man drew closer, Yuki instinctively tensed. What was he thinking, seeing her standing there, a Japanese woman POW, a ghost from a world she no longer recognized? What would he do? What would he say? But instead of hostility, instead of suspicion, he offered a quiet nod, tipping his hat in a gesture that spoke of mutual respect. Yuki blinked in confusion. In all her months in captivity, she had never once experienced this kind of silent acknowledgement from her captors. This man, this cowboy, didn't look at her with contempt or as an enemy. He simply saw her as a human being, standing there in the heat of the Texas sun. Yuki stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to react. This was a new world, one filled with strange freedom, strange kindness. She had been taught that the enemy was always to be feared, to be fought. But standing there in the middle of Texas under a sky that seemed to stretch forever, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. This wasn't a battlefield. This wasn't war. This was something else entirely. The Texas sun beat down relentlessly on the small convoy of trucks, each one packed with the tired, hungry faces of Japanese women prisoners of war. Their journey had been long, the days dragging on like an endless stretch of barren road. But nothing had prepared them for what awaited them here, in this desolate corner of East Texas. As the trucks rumbled to a halt, Yuki Tanaka peered through the grimy window. Her heart hammered against her chest as she took in the vastness of the land. The earth seemed to stretch endlessly, like a horizon that had no end. She had heard stories about America, about its size, its wild beauty, its rugged, untamed nature. But to see it firsthand, to breathe in the thick, warm air, was something altogether different. The sight before her was bewildering. There were men, tall and broad-shouldered, standing by massive logs that were being hoisted by ropes and pulleys. They were dressed in rough denim, their shirts rolled up at the sleeves, revealing the muscles that rippled beneath the fabric. Their faces were weathered, their hats pulled low to shield their eyes from the sun. Yuki couldn't help but stare, mesmerized by the raw physicality of them. These men were not soldiers. They were not the men she had been trained to fight against. They were lumberjacks, workers of the land as foreign to her as the vast Texas sky itself. Their strength was evident in every move they made, the way their hands gripped axes and chains with ease, the rhythm of their work as natural as breathing. Yuki shifted uncomfortably on the edge of the truck bed, the chains still shackling her wrists. Beside her, other women POWs murmured nervously, their voices low, hesitant. They had heard the rumors. These were the men they had been sent to work for, and the fear of the unknown gnawed at them. They had spent years in camps living under the constant weight of war. The thought of being thrust into a new kind of existence, surrounded by men who seemed so alien to them, was overwhelming. "What is this place?" one of the women whispered in broken English, her voice trembling. Yuki didn't have an answer. She only knew that this vast open land felt both terrifying and strangely inviting. She felt out of place, as if she were a stranger in a world that had no room for her. The cowboys, another term she had heard but never truly understood, were now in plain sight, mounted on horses that moved like shadows across the golden fields. Their tall hats and boots added to their mysterious aura. They were so unlike the soldiers she had known, so free, so wild. The trucks rolled forward, and Yuki's gaze flickered to the men working nearby. They didn't look at her with suspicion or anger. Instead, their eyes seemed to carry a kind of indifference, a lack of interest in the women POWs who had just been dropped in their midst. The men had an air of calm confidence, like they belonged to the land. They were the land, and in that moment, Yuki realized something she had never expected to feel, a sharp pang of envy. She had lived her entire life within the walls of war. Everything had been dictated by the whims of her government, the needs of her military, the confines of her duty. But here, in this foreign place, the men moved as if they answered to no one but themselves. They weren't soldiers. They weren't driven by the goals of war. They were builders, shaping the world around them with their hands and strength. The truck came to a stop in front of a weathered barn, its wood faded and worn from years of labor. The men dropped their tools and began to direct the women POWs to various workstations. Yuki hesitated for a moment, the reality of the situation sinking in. She had been taken from one prison, only to be placed into another. But this one was different. This place was alive. There were no walls, no barbed wire, no gun-toting soldiers. Instead, there were only the endless, untamed fields and the men who worked them. "Move it, you lot," barked a burly man with a thick beard, his voice rough but not unkind. He gestured toward a line of wooden crates filled with vegetables. "You'll be working the fields. Can't waste time." Yuki and the others were pushed into action. She found herself sorting through crates of vegetables, her hands trembling as she moved through the task mechanically. It was a far cry from the rigid drills she had known in the camps, but it was work nonetheless. The men continued to move around them, their muscles flexing as they carried heavy loads of timber and logs. They worked with a purpose, but there was a calmness to their actions, as if this was simply their way of life, the rhythm of their days, the pulse of the land. Yuki's eyes wandered back to the men, and for the first time she felt a strange, inexplicable fear. It wasn't the fear she had known in the camps where danger lurked around every corner. This fear was different. It was the fear of being out of place, the fear of being exposed in a world she didn't understand. But as she worked beside the others, the sun sinking lower in the sky, she realized something else too. It wasn't just fear she was feeling. It was also a strange sense of fascination. These men, these lumberjacks and cowboys, had something she had never known before. They had a freedom that she could not even begin to comprehend. And in that fleeting moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sounds of the camp faded into the quiet of the evening, Yuki wondered if she would ever be able to find that same freedom. The days that followed blurred into one another, the rhythm of the camp settling into an unspoken routine. Each morning, the women POWs were gathered and assigned to their tasks, cleaning, cooking, sorting through crates, or sometimes carrying water to the far end of the camp. The work was simple, repetitive, but it was still better than the endless hours of isolation and fear they had endured in the prison camps. Yet, no matter how many days passed, Yuki Tanaka could not shake the overwhelming strangeness of this place. The American cowboys and lumberjacks remained as unfamiliar to her as the very land itself. They were not like the soldiers she had encountered before. They weren't driven by ideology or duty. They didn't see their work as part of some greater cause. They were just men, living out their days under the hot Texas sun, working the land with a rhythm she couldn't understand. Yuki had never seen anything like it. The land was so alive here. She could feel it in the air, in the way the men worked, in the way the horses moved across the field with such effortless grace. There were no orders, no drills. There was just a deep connection to the earth, something she had never felt before. Her mind wandered back to the conversations she had overheard during her first days at the camp. Cowboys, a term that had seemed almost mythical to her, like something from a storybook. The way they wore their hats, their rugged clothes, and how they carried themselves with such ease and confidence made them appear almost like figures from another time, another world. One morning, after finishing her assigned task of cleaning the kitchen, Yuki found herself lingering near a group of the cowboys who were preparing for the day's work. Their voices were loud and free, filled with laughter and the occasional grumble about the weather or the state of the timber they were working with. There was something infectious about their energy, something that felt both foreign and oddly inviting. As Yuki gathered the courage to get closer, one of the men, a stocky figure with a thick mustache, caught her eye. He gave her a small, curious glance before turning back to his work. Brennan, a man Yuki had noticed earlier in the week, was standing with his back to her, speaking to another worker about the tools they'd need for the day. Cole was different from the other men. He wasn't as loud, nor did he have the same brash confidence as the others. Instead, he moved with purpose, his actions deliberate yet somehow gentle. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, and his face carried the subtle weight of someone who had seen much yet spoke little. Yuki had watched him carefully, his eyes soft but steady, his way of moving as though he knew exactly where he belonged in this vast, untamed world. It wasn't just the way he worked that caught her attention. It was the way he looked at her when their paths crossed. For a moment, when their eyes met, she saw something flicker in his expression, something soft. But in an instant it was gone, replaced by the usual indifferent gaze the other men offered her. Yet Yuki couldn't shake the feeling that Cole saw her as more than just another prisoner of war. She couldn't explain why, but his presence felt different. There was no anger, no hatred in the way he looked at her. It was as if, despite everything, he understood her in a way no one else ever had. The more Yuki observed him, the more her curiosity grew. Cole would often stand apart from the others during breaks, leaning against a fence, watching the horses graze or the workers chop wood. He was quiet, introspective, a stark contrast to the bustling energy around him. Yuki would occasionally catch him glancing her way, but he never spoke to her directly. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, the camp became quieter. The day's work was winding down, and Yuki was standing near the barn washing dishes. The sound of horse hooves brought her attention back to the field, where Cole was riding toward her, his horse trotting calmly behind him. He was alone, his silhouette framed against the setting sun. Yuki's heart skipped a beat as he approached. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron and lowered her gaze. She wasn't sure what she expected, but it certainly wasn't the calm, steady look he gave her as he stopped in front of the barn. "You've been working hard today, Miss Tanaka." His voice was deep but not harsh, a quiet acknowledgement of her efforts. Yuki hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The language barrier made everything feel more complicated. But somehow she felt she understood the sentiment in his words. It wasn't just an observation. It was a recognition of her humanity. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice soft. Cole nodded, tipping his hat slightly. He paused for a moment, looking at her with those same steady eyes. Then, without another word, he turned his horse around and rode back toward the camp. As Yuki watched him disappear into the distance, a strange feeling washed over her. She was still a prisoner, still trapped in a world she couldn't control, but for a brief moment she had felt something else, something that wasn't fear or duty or hate. It was something simpler, something far more human. The days began to blend together, a seamless flow of work and silence. Yuki Tanaka had long stopped counting the hours. Time no longer felt linear in the way it had in the prison camp, where every minute felt heavy and oppressive. Here, in the vastness of East Texas, the hours seemed to stretch and shift like the land itself, expansive and open. The work was hard, but it was also straightforward. There were no complex orders, no endless commands shouted in foreign languages. Every task here, whether it was sorting through firewood, cleaning the stables, or preparing the evening meal, had a clear purpose. Yuki found a rhythm in this simplicity, a rhythm that allowed her mind to wander. Her thoughts often returned to Cole Brennan, the cowboy who had first spoken to her with that quiet tone, his eyes offering something more than the usual indifference. His presence had begun to weigh on her thoughts like the heat of the midday sun. She couldn't help but wonder about him, about who he was, where he had come from, and why he seemed so different from the other men in the camp. She had always believed that the enemy was something that could be defined. They were soldiers. They wore uniforms and they carried weapons. But Cole wasn't like that. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't wear the same uniform as the others. And despite the differences between them, Yuki could not shake the feeling that he was more human, more relatable, than the soldiers she had known. It was difficult to explain, especially given the circumstances. She had been taught to view the enemy as the other, as someone to fight, someone to defeat. Yet here in this strange land, the lines between enemies and allies were beginning to blur. Was it because of the work they shared? Or was it something deeper? A recognition that both she and Cole were caught in the same terrible war, bound by forces far greater than their own choices. One afternoon, as Yuki worked alongside some of the other women in the camp, she overheard a conversation between two of the lumberjacks. They were talking about the war, about their brothers who had gone off to fight, about the hardship of living in such isolation. Their words were simple, and at first, they seemed like nothing more than idle chatter. But then one of them, a tall man with a grizzled beard, said something that caught Yuki's attention. "You know, I don't get why we're fighting over this land in Europe. Why not just let them figure it out on their own?" The other man laughed, wiping his brow. "That's the way the world works, I guess. Everyone's got to choose a side, right?" The words hung in the air like a weight Yuki hadn't expected. She had spent so many months surrounded by the rhetoric of war, the constant barrage of propaganda that painted the world in black and white. But this conversation, this simple exchange, opened her eyes to something she hadn't allowed herself to consider, that perhaps not everyone, not every man was fighting for the same reasons. For the first time, Yuki felt a shift in her perspective. These men weren't just lumberjacks. They were people. They had families, histories, and beliefs just like anyone else. The complexity of their lives began to unfold in Yuki's mind. She no longer saw them as just the enemy or as tools of a foreign government. They were, in fact, individuals with their own struggles, their own feelings of fear and loss, much like her own. Later that evening, after another long day of work, Yuki found herself alone in the barn, sorting through supplies. The others had already gone to bed, but she couldn't sleep. Her mind raced, turning over the conversation she had overheard and the thoughts that had begun to flood her mind. What did it mean to be human? Was it possible to be so different and yet share the same longing for connection? As she pondered these questions, Cole Brennan appeared in the doorway. He didn't speak at first, just stood there in the dim light, his figure outlined by the fading sunlight outside. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Yuki's heart pounded in her chest, a feeling she couldn't explain. Then Cole stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards as he crossed the barn to where she stood. "You all right?" His voice was gentle, but there was an undercurrent of concern in it that she hadn't expected. Yuki nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She wasn't sure what to say, what to feel. She wasn't used to having these kinds of conversations with soldiers, with enemies, but Cole didn't wait for her to respond. He simply stood there leaning against the wall beside her, offering her the quiet company of someone who understood the weight of being far from home. For a long time, they stood in silence, the only sound the distant creak of the barn and the soft rustling of the evening wind. It was as if the world outside didn't exist anymore, and in that moment there were no prisoners, no soldiers. There was only Yuki and Cole, two people bound together by a war neither of them had chosen. Eventually, Cole broke the silence. "You know you've got a strong spirit. A lot of people would have given up by now." Yuki glanced at him, surprised by the sincerity in his words. For the first time since arriving in Texas, she felt like someone saw her, truly saw her, beyond the uniform, beyond the prisoner of war status. She wasn't just an enemy. She was a person. "Thank you, Cole." The words were soft, but they held a weight she couldn't ignore. Cole nodded, offering her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I reckon you'll be all right here. We're all just trying to get through this, after all." As he left, disappearing back into the evening light, Yuki stood in the quiet barn, her thoughts racing. She was still a prisoner. She was still a long way from home. But in that brief moment with the cowboy standing beside her, she felt something different stir inside her. Hope. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life at the lumber camp began to feel almost normal. The work was tough but manageable. The sun rose early, and the women POWs were assigned tasks that kept them moving, cleaning, cooking, and carrying wood. The monotony, however, didn't dull the sense of unease that still lingered in Yuki's chest. Her time spent in the company of the men, Cole Brennan especially, had left her with conflicting emotions. She could no longer deny that there was something in her that responded to him. He had a way of speaking that was different from the others, a quiet certainty that made her feel as though, for just a moment, they could escape the harshness of the war. But the bond between them was not only complicated by their differing backgrounds, but also by the impossibility of any real future between them. Yet, the more time passed, the more Yuki found herself looking for reasons to cross paths with Cole. Whether it was watching him work with the horses, or quietly helping him with the logs, she found herself seeking out these small moments, even though a part of her resisted the idea of forming any emotional attachment. One late afternoon, the sky stretching its amber fingers over the fields, Yuki was collecting firewood when she found herself once again near Cole. This time, he was busy fixing one of the wagons, his broad shoulders hunched over as he tightened bolts, the muscles of his back flexing with each movement. She tried not to stare, but she couldn't help herself. There was something almost poetic in the way he moved, an effortless rhythm to his actions that seemed to echo the natural world around them. "You're working hard again, Miss Tanaka," he called out without looking up, as if sensing her presence. Yuki blinked, caught off guard. I've been working since sunrise," she replied, trying to maintain a tone of nonchalance, though her heart was racing in her chest. "I can see that." He chuckled softly, then finally looked up, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes were warm, almost inviting, but there was an edge to his expression, one that Yuki couldn't quite place. The tension between them was palpable, and yet, there was a strange sense of comfort in his presence. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. Cole broke the silence. "You're not like the others." His words were slow, deliberate. Yuki blinked in confusion, unsure of how to respond. "What do you mean?" He wiped his hands on his pants and then stepped toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You don't carry yourself like a prisoner. You don't let them break you." Yuki felt her throat tighten. The truth of his words stung. She had spent so many months learning to hide her true feelings, to remain outwardly stoic in the face of harsh treatment. But now Cole's observation made her realize just how much she had internalized the sense of being trapped, of being less than human. In this place, she wasn't just a soldier's daughter or a woman caught in the throes of war. She was a prisoner, marked by the scars of a nation's conflict. And yet, here she was, caught between the world of the enemy and the world of a man who didn't see her as a symbol of war. He saw her as a person he admired. "I just do what I have to do," Yuki murmured, her eyes shifting to the ground. Cole tilted his head slightly. "That's what I admire about you, Yuki." He stepped closer, a small smile pulling at the corner of his lips. "You don't give up." Yuki's heart skipped a beat. He had used her name. She hadn't realized it before, but the sound of it coming from his lips made something inside her stir. It was the first time anyone had called her by name since arriving at the camp. The small act felt intimate, personal, something that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't been in a long time. "It's all we can do, isn't it?" she whispered, barely above a breath. Cole's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of understanding. He stepped back as if the connection between them had momentarily made him uneasy. "I reckon so." He turned back to the wagon and resumed his work. But there was an unspoken shift in the air, an awareness that lingered like the last rays of the setting sun. As Yuki returned to her work, her thoughts swirled in a dizzying mix of emotions. She had tried to keep her distance, tried to block out the growing warmth between them, but it was getting harder. Every glance, every exchange, felt like another step toward something she wasn't sure she was ready for. The widening gap between their two worlds seemed insurmountable. The lines drawn by the war, by nationality, by duty. And yet Cole's kindness, his recognition of her humanity, felt like a bridge between those gaps, a connection that refused to be ignored. That night, as the camp settled into its usual quiet, Yuki lay awake in her small cot, staring up at the darkened ceiling. The faint sound of the campfire crackling outside drifted in through the cracked window, and she felt a strange mixture of longing and fear. Was it possible for a woman like her, a prisoner of war, to find solace in the eyes of the enemy? To find peace or even love in a place built on hatred? Her heart raced at the thought. But for the first time since arriving in Texas, she wondered what it would be like to live in a world where the boundaries of war were no longer the defining force. She had never imagined a place like this, a place where hope felt like it could grow in the most unexpected of soils. The work at the lumber camp never seemed to slow down. Days stretched into one another, each marked by the rhythm of the saws, the steady sound of axes chopping wood, and the endless hours under the unforgiving Texas sun. Yet for Yuki Tanaka, the world around her had become a series of small revelations. Every day felt like a shift, a breaking down of walls she had spent years building. Walls between her and the outside world, between herself and the people around her. She had been here long enough now to see that the Lumberjacks and Cowboys weren't so different from the soldiers she had known in Japan. They were men shaped by war, shaped by their land, shaped by their struggles. But there was a quiet strength in them, a resilience that wasn't driven by duty to a higher power or a national cause. It was driven by survival, by the need to live freely, to live for themselves. And in that, Yuki found a strange sense of connection. But it wasn't just the men's physical strength that began to pull at her heart. It was their quiet humanity, the way they went about their work without fanfare or pride, their ability to create something from the land without trying to dominate it. Yuki could see that in the way they cared for the horses, in the way they worked together, always with a sense of community that was hard to explain. They weren't just workers. They were builders in the truest sense of the word. The warmth she had felt in Cole's presence had slowly grown into something more. She found herself seeking him out, not because she was afraid of being alone, but because there was a comfort in the way he understood the world around him. She had never seen a man so connected to the land, and now, the more she observed, the more she realized how much she longed to be a part of it, to be a part of something that didn't involve death, conflict, or division. One day, as the men worked to clear a new section of land, Yuki was assigned to help haul logs from one area to another. The sun was blazing overhead and she could feel her skin starting to burn beneath her thin uniform. She was exhausted, but the work felt different here, more alive. As she shifted a heavy log, the familiar voice of Cole caught her off guard. "You need some help, Miss Tanaka?" Yuki looked up, surprised. He had been working in the distance, yet somehow had made his way over to her, offering his help without hesitation. He wasn't like the others. He didn't see her as just a POW or an outsider. He saw her as someone who was part of this world. even if for only a brief moment. "I'm fine, Cole," Yuki said, her voice breathless from the labor. But she knew deep down that she wasn't fine. She was tired, both physically and emotionally. But more than that, she was conflicted. The closer she got to Cole, the more she began to question her place in the world. Could she allow herself to care for someone in a time like this? Cole stood still for a moment, studying her, his expression softening as he wiped the sweat from his brow. "You've been working hard all week. Maybe it's time for a break." His offer felt genuine, but Yuki wasn't sure if she could afford to take a break. Not when the memory of her country's war effort still echoed in her mind. But as Cole stepped forward, his presence comforting and uncomplicated, she felt a strange weight lift from her shoulders. In his eyes, she saw not the enemy, not the faceless opposition, but a person, a fellow soul trying to navigate a world that had been torn apart by war. "All right, a break it is." She finally relented, her lips curving into the smallest of smiles. Cole nodded in approval, leading her away from the worksite toward a small, shaded area beneath a few old oak trees. As they sat together in the cool shade, Yuki watched Cole carefully, noticing the way his shoulders relaxed for the first time all day. It struck her that even men like him needed moments of peace. They weren't invincible. They weren't soldiers, after all. They were just men trying to make a life in the midst of everything that had gone wrong. And yet here, in this strange corner of Texas, they had carved out a sense of home. Cole leaned back against the trunk of a tree, crossing his arms behind his head. "You know, Miss Tanaka, you're one of the hardest workers I've seen here." His voice was calm, but there was something more in it. A respect that seemed to go beyond the surface of things. Yuki felt a rush of warmth at his words, and despite herself, a part of her began to soften. No one had ever said anything like that to her. The words weren't spoken out of duty, like those from the guards in the camps. They were spoken as if Cole had genuinely noticed something about her. "I have to work hard to survive, Cole. We all do." Her voice was quiet, thoughtful. She glanced at him, unsure of where this conversation was leading, but unable to stop herself from opening up. Cole nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving her. "We all have our reasons for working, but sometimes it's not about surviving anymore. It's about living." The words lingered in the air between them, and for a moment everything else in the war, the camp, the distance between them, seemed to vanish. There was only the present, the here and now, the shared understanding between them that in this world, survival wasn't enough. Yuki shifted her gaze to the sky, where the sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon. The camp was peaceful in this fleeting moment, as though it too had paused to breathe. Perhaps it was possible, she thought, to find something more than just survival. "I never thought I'd find peace in a place like this," Yuki whispered. Cole turned his head to look at her, his eyes soft and steady. "Maybe peace finds you when you least expect it." The silence that followed felt almost sacred, a fleeting moment of understanding shared between them. It was a brief break from the tension of war, from the conflict that lay at the heart of everything they did. But it was enough. The days were growing shorter as the heat of summer began to fade into the cool breath of autumn. Yuki Tanaka had been at the camp for months now, and though the routine had become familiar, the sense of alienation never completely left her. Despite the hard work, the sweat, and the long hours, there was something that still nagged at her. Something inside her that refused to be ignored. The camp itself had become a strange world where boundaries blurred, between enemies and friends, between war and peace. But the more time Yuki spent in the company of the Lumberjacks and Cowboys, the more she realized just how much she had been shaped by the war. These men were not soldiers, nor were they enemies in the traditional sense. They had families, dreams, and lives that existed outside the realm of conflict. They were people, not symbols of a war. And yet the tension between Yuki's emotions and her reality was impossible to ignore. Cole Brennan, the cowboy she had come to care for, had become a constant presence in her life. His kindness, his gentle words, his understanding of her. It all stirred something in her heart that she couldn't deny. But the conflict was growing harder to ignore. What could come of a bond between them? She was a prisoner of war and he was a free man, a cowboy, far from the ideals of the Japanese military. The walls that had once separated them were so high, so insurmountable, that even her own feelings felt like an act of betrayal to her homeland. Yet as they worked together, It became clearer that the bond between them couldn't be easily dismissed. One afternoon, after a long day of cutting timber and moving heavy logs, Cole approached Yuki while she was sitting near the barn, catching her breath. "You've been working hard today." "Miss Tanaka," he said, his voice steady but gentle. Yuki looked up at him surprised and gave him a small, tired smile. "It's nothing compared to what you do every day." Cole sat down beside her, his legs stretching out in front of him. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared space where words didn't need to fill the air. It was in moments like these that the weight of the world seemed to lift, even if just for a short while. "I've been thinking," Cole began, breaking the silence. Yuki turned her head slightly curious. "About your people. About Japan." Yuki felt a pang of unease at his words. She knew where this conversation might be headed. "What about them?" she asked, her voice cautious but not unfriendly. "I've heard a lot about your country." Cole continued, his tone calm but thoughtful. "What's it like? Back there? I mean, it's all I hear about from the men and the news. I can't imagine what it must be like fighting a war like this." Yuki was silent for a moment, her mind racing as she tried to choose her words carefully. She had spent so much time trying to avoid this question, not wanting to dwell on the distance between their worlds, but now with Cole's steady gaze on her, she felt compelled to answer. It's hard to explain," she said softly, her eyes gazing downward. "War is not something you can easily understand until you're in it. The soldiers don't think of the enemy as people anymore. We see only the enemy's face, not the person behind it. We fight because we are told to, because it's what our country expects of us." Cole nodded, listening intently, his eyes reflecting the weight of her words. "I get it," he said quietly. "You do what you have to do. But it doesn't change the fact that we're all just people, right? We fight for something bigger than ourselves, but in the end it's about survival. It's about keeping what you love safe." Yuki turned to him, meeting his gaze for the first time in a long while. His words, simple as they were, carried a depth she hadn't expected. The truth was undeniable. War was about survival, but at the heart of it all there was something more human that tied them all together. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to express the confusion that had begun to bubble up inside her. All her life she had been taught that the enemy was someone to fear, someone to destroy. But here in this far-off land she was seeing a different kind of man, a man who fought not for power but for the land and people he cared about. He wasn't so different from her. He wasn't the enemy. He was just a man, trying to survive in a world torn apart by forces he couldn't control. "You're right, Cole," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're all just trying to survive." Cole looked at her, his expression softening. "Yeah, but sometimes surviving isn't enough, is it?" His words lingered in the air like a promise, and Yuki couldn't help but feel a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, Yuki sat beside Cole, silently reflecting on everything she had come to understand in the past few months. Her world had been turned upside down since arriving at the camp, and yet for the first time she felt like maybe there was more to life than survival. Maybe, just maybe, there was something else to hold on to. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't erase the war, the years of violence and hatred. But in this moment, with the sounds of the evening settling around them, she could at least begin to imagine a future where hope and humanity existed, even in the darkest of times. As the weeks turned into months, the relationship between Yuki Tanaka and Cole Brennan continued to evolve. What had begun as a simple exchange of kindness and curiosity now felt more complicated and more dangerous. Yuki found herself grappling with a multitude of conflicting emotions. She had once believed that the war was black and white, with clear lines between enemies and allies. But now, standing in this foreign land, surrounded by men who weren't soldiers but ordinary men, those lines had blurred. The connection she felt to Cole, undeniable as it was, made her question everything she had ever been taught. Could a Japanese woman, a prisoner of war, truly find solace and understanding with someone like him? A cowboy, a man who had once been her enemy. The thought felt almost treacherous. Yet the longer she stayed in the camp, the stronger her feelings for him grew. And with those feelings came a heavy burden, the guilt of betraying the ideals she had once held dear. As autumn deepened and the camp settled into its quiet rhythm, the work remained constant. Days were filled with the clang of tools, the rustling of sawdust, and the shouts of the men working the timber. Yuki often found herself working side by side with the lumberjacks, the hours stretching on with little conversation. But the silence between her and Cole had become more charged, more loaded. Each glance exchanged between them filled with unspoken words. One morning, after an exhausting day of hauling wood, Yuki was resting near the edge of the camp, her back against a rough wooden post, watching the men break for lunch. The heat of the day had softened, and the air had a faint chill that reminded her of the cold nights she had spent in the prison camps. Cole approached her, his boots crunching on the gravel as he drew near. For a moment he said nothing, only standing beside her, his gaze steady and knowing. Yuki felt the weight of his presence beside her, and despite the distance between them, something inside her stirred into an urge to speak, to release the emotions that had built up inside her since arriving. "Cole," she began softly, her voice barely audible over the distant chatter of the men. "Why do you do this? Why do you stay here in this camp, working day after day?" Her words hung in the air, a question she had wanted to ask for so long but hadn't been able to voice. Cole looked at her, his expression unreadable at first. Then after a long moment he sat down beside her, the rough edge of his jacket brushing against her arm. "I stay because I have to. It's all I know. It's what I've always done." He paused, his hands resting on his knees. "I guess it's about making something of yourself. You know, after everything that's happened." Yuki nodded, understanding more than she let on. She had heard stories of men like Cole, men who had fought in wars only to return to the land they knew, rebuilding it with their bare hands.
She had seen it in the way they worked, the way they built not just homes but lives, as if the land itself could be made into something more than just a battlefield. "But you never had a choice in it, did you?"
Yuki asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question was more to herself than to Cole, but he heard it nonetheless. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. "No, I guess not. None of us really have a choice in any of this, do we?" His voice was gentle, but there was a sadness in it that Yuki had not expected. It was in that moment, sitting side by side with Cole, that Yuki realized something fundamental. They were not so different after all. Both had been swept up in something far beyond their control, carried along by forces much larger than themselves. Both had been trapped by the war, by circumstances that forced them into roles they had not chosen. "I never thought I'd be here, you know," Yuki said, her voice shaking slightly. "I thought I'd always be in Japan, serving my country. That's what they told us we were meant to do." Cole's eyes softened as he looked at her. "And now?" he asked, his voice calm, as though he already knew the answer. Yuki paused, reflecting on the words that had been lodged in her heart since she first arrived at the camp. Her emotions were tangled, confused, but one truth had emerged clear and undeniable. She could no longer see the world in simple terms of enemies and allies. There was more to every person than the uniform they wore or the title they carried. There was humanity. "Now I'm just trying to survive, Cole, like you, like everyone here." Her words were quiet, but they held a weight she had never felt before. "I don't know what I believe anymore." Cole didn't respond at first. Instead, he sat silently beside her, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. He didn't need to say anything. The silence between them felt comfortable now, not like an awkward pause, but a space for shared understanding. After a while, Cole stood up, brushing the dirt from his pants. "Well, Miss Tanaka," he said with a small grin, "I reckon we all have our reasons for surviving. But one thing I know for sure, you've got a lot of fight left in you. Don't forget that." Yuki watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the crowd of workers. His words lingered in her mind long after he was gone, echoing in the quiet of the camp. There was more to fight for, more to live for, than she had ever imagined. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Yuki sat in silence, feeling the weight of the day settle into her bones. But for the first time in months, it was different. There was something within her that hadn't been there before. A small spark of something that might one day grow into hope. The days had grown shorter, the evenings cooler, and Yuki Tanaka could feel a shift in the air, like the land itself was preparing for change. She had spent so many months navigating the boundaries of survival, but now something inside her had begun to shift, the question that had occupied her thoughts since she arrived in the camp. What happens next? Now seemed clearer than it ever had before. She had found a rhythm, a strange kind of peace in the hard work. The smell of freshly cut timber, the sound of saws slicing through the thick wood, the creak of horses pulling heavy loads. These had become the sounds of her world. The men who had once seemed so foreign to her now felt like an undeniable part of her existence. They weren't her enemies anymore, but fellow human beings trying to make sense of a world that had been broken by war. Cole Brennan remained a constant presence in her life. His quiet strength, his unspoken kindness had slowly wrapped itself around her like the thick ropes the lumberjacks used to pull the logs. She couldn't deny the growing feelings that tied her to him, though she knew the boundaries between them were still too high, too impossible to cross, and yet the more time passed, the more she realized that the connection between them wasn't just about survival. It was about something more, something that she had never allowed herself to feel before. One evening, as the camp settled into its usual quiet, Yuki found herself standing at the edge of the barn, watching the men finish their work for the day. The sky was fading into twilight, the stars slowly starting to appear. She inhaled deeply, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. It was a rare moment of stillness, a rare moment where she could simply be, not a prisoner, not a symbol of war, but just herself. "Miss Tanaka," a familiar voice called from behind her. It was Cole walking toward her, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze meeting hers with that same quiet intensity that always made her heart skip a beat. "You've been out here a while, haven't you?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Everything all right?" Yuki turned to face him, her heart suddenly pounding. She had grown so accustomed to his presence, to the way he understood her without needing words, that sometimes it felt like they were the only two people left in the world. "Just thinking," she replied softly, her voice carrying a weight that she couldn't explain. "It's been a long time since I've had the chance to just think." Cole nodded, stepping closer. "I know what you mean. Sometimes the days here feel like they last forever. But at least we're alive, right?" His eyes searched hers as if looking for something, a response, an acknowledgement, a sign that she felt the same way he did. Yuki's heart skipped another beat. She wanted to speak, to say something that would make everything between them feel right, but the words wouldn't come. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed, seemed so distant now. She had spent so much of her life fighting for something greater, fighting for a cause that now felt hollow and meaningless. But with Cole, things were different. With him, she felt like a person. Not a soldier, not an enemy, just a woman, caught in a world that had been torn apart by the same war she had been born into. "You're right, Cole," she finally whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "We're alive. But sometimes I wonder if that's enough." Cole tilted his head, his expression softening. "Maybe it's enough for now. Maybe that's all we can do, just keep surviving one day at a time." The silence between them felt thick with emotion, with understanding that went beyond words. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Yuki could feel the weight of Cole's gaze on her, and for the first time since arriving at the camp, she allowed herself to truly feel the connection that had been growing between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about enduring the days in the camp. It was about choosing to live, choosing to find moments of peace in the middle of chaos, choosing to believe that there was still good in the world, despite everything. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Cole spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe one day this will all be over. Maybe we'll get the chance to leave this place behind, to build something better, something that isn't defined by war." Yuki's heart ached at the thought. The war had stolen so much from her. It had stolen her family, her country, her sense of identity. But here, in this small corner of Texas, among the men who had once been her enemies, she had found something she thought she had lost, a sense of hope. "Maybe we will," she said softly, her gaze lingering on the fading light of the horizon. "But even if we don't, I think we've already found something worth fighting for." Cole's eyes searched hers for a moment before he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Yeah, maybe we have." The evening stretched on in quiet companionship, the sounds of the camp fading into the night. Yuki felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she would ever return to Japan, if she would ever be able to put the pieces of her life back together. But for the first time, she felt that there was a future where hope and humanity could survive, even after the horrors of war. As the stars filled the sky above them, Yuki and Cole sat together, knowing that the journey ahead was uncertain, but at least, for now, they weren't alone. As Yuki Tanaka's journey in Texas unfolds, we're reminded of the humanity that transcends borders and uniforms. In the midst of war, amidst enemies and fear, it's moments of connection, of understanding that shine through as the true victory. The bond between Yuki and Cole defies everything they've been taught, and proves that even in the darkest of times, compassion can break through. What do you think? Can humanity truly exist on both sides of a war? Or is the line between friend and foe too deep to cross? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more incredible, true stories from WW2 that remind us of the power of compassion and resilience. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. We've got many more WW2 frontline coming your way. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that even in the toughest times, humanity can still find a way to reach out. Let's keep these important stories alive.